Howdy, Chess College. How y'all doing out there? Getting your papers done? Please make sure you look at the instructions. Um, they're pretty accurate when I'm looking for. If you have any issues, you got to contact me. Please do not be late. Once it closes, it closes. Then there's no recourse. You can contact me and you can beg for forgiveness, and maybe I'll give you a break on this first one. Anyway, so to be late, you've had plenty of time to do it. Hope you enjoyed the movie and it wasn't too much torture. Charlie Chaplin at his most profound. Look at the elements of the thing and break it down and analyze it. Why does it work? How does it work? But try to refrain from explaining the plot. That's not what I'm asking you to do. Okay, so that's all due this Friday, 11:59 p.m. It's 1 minute to midnight. I'll sign another essay soon, probably not till Monday. So don't worry about that. I'm going to do a discussion. I'll put that up there on the board today. And it's a simple question. After watching a few of these silent things, you've watched some film clips. Hopefully you've watched the previews from Metropolis. Who is it? What's going on, Peter? I'm on a Zoom call with my colleague. What do you need? You need a ride? Take you home? Yeah, no problem. Make sure you get at least 3 pages, 3 to 5 pages. Writing these essays is a discipline, and so that's why the page count. If it's below the page count, you'll lose some points. If it's over the page count, you won't lose any points. But just try to keep it 3 to 5. That's reasonable. When you progress in your college career, you'll be writing 30 pages, 50 pages. My dissertation for my master's was 100 pages. And yes, they were counting. So this is just part of the college academic life. Okay, so on the discussion, just why don't you just say, what was your experience with these silent films? Hopefully you've watched The Kid by now. You've watched some of those previews I've asked you to watch. Hope you enjoyed them. It wasn't too much torture. Just tell us what you share with your first impressions of. These are probably your first experiences with silent films. You've probably heard of them and avoided them all your life. There's a lot of great silent films out there, and once you get into this sort of cinema, deep cinema, you'll see that most current cinema is standing on the shoulders of our history, of our cinema. Anyway, so we're coming out of the decade now. The roaring 20s are about ready to crash and burn. Things are looking really well in the country. We're 10 years away out of the war now. We're healing our war wounds. We're never going to go to war again. But Hitler has different ideas, but not yet. In the meantime, the roaring 20s was a pretty good time in America. Movies were thriving. People had jobs. Illegal booze that made people unhappy. That gave rise to a lot of crime and gangsters, which I'm going to talk about next time, because in the 1930s, we had the rise of the gangster film because of Prohibition. See how the culture reflects on Hollywood, and then Hollywood reflects on the culture. They don't work in a vacuum. It's cause and effect. What's going on in the culture is going on in Hollywood, or we wouldn't relate to what we're seeing on the screen. We're seeing stuff we relate to. Now, here's my problem, and I do have a problem with a lot of current films, Marvel comics, DC comic films. I don't know that world. That's not a world. It's a fantasy world. The world doesn't exist. Sorry, folks. There is no Spider-Man. There is no Batman. There's no Superman. Is it fun to watch? Absolutely. But it's hard to see us, regular person, because these superheroes are always coming to saving us because we can't save ourselves. Oh, don't get me started about these guys. But we'll be talking about that later on as we get into current cinema. I know you can't wait. But it's about another 12 weeks from now, so have patience. Anyway, this obsession with Hollywood trying to make money is real, and they still are obsessed with it. And they were making a lot of money on people through the 20s, believe it or not. These Hollywood stars, I mentioned several of them, people from Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford, Doug Fairbanks Jr., were making very good paychecks. $40,000, $50,000 a week. That would be pretty good now. But then it's like millions of dollars a week. They lived in palatial mansions in the Hollywood area. Beverly Hills was being built up like crazy. And the people who were running the studios were bound and determined to make as much money as they can. But they were also making really personal, relevant stories. They weren't going outside and making stories that nobody could relate to, or the audience wouldn't show up. So you see a Charlie Chaplin movie or a Buster Keaton movie, and you see how downtrodden they are, and they're ordinary, and life is not treating them well. Well, that's how most people felt about their own lives, and so they related to it. Then people like Mary Pickford and Gloria Swanson were these romantic ideals, and we're all looking for romance, supposedly. And then people like Doug Fairbanks and Rudolph Valentino are heroes, but not in a superhero sense. They were of this world. They were flawed human beings, and they came in and they saved the woman in distress, and we rooted for them. Rudolph Valentino was a tragic story. He was never made a sound film. He had a very heavy accent from Italy, and like a lot of silent film stars, they were from different countries in Europe. And this myth, there's a myth, maybe you've heard about it, maybe not, you'll hear it now, that a lot of the transitory silent actors didn't make the transition to talkies because they had bad voices. It wasn't the quality of their voice, folks. It was the fact that they had heavy accents and nobody could understand their English. And there was a lot of them. And they lost their careers when sound came in, which came in about late 20s. People like a few made the transition, but they had heavy accents. I'll talk about them later. Anyway, getting ahead of myself here. So the culture looks like it's thriving, except for the illegal booze, which is causing killings. Gangsters, maybe you've seen the movie The Untouchables, maybe you've heard of that. It was a TV series in the late 50s, early 60s. It was really popular when I was a kid. The FBI, led by Elliot Ness, went after the bootleggers and the illegal boozers who are making a fortune on people's addiction to alcohol, but they're also very cutthroat and killed people who betrayed them or got in their way. Yeah, so in Chicago, New York, Detroit, these big cities were run by crime lords. This is before the mob. They called it the mob. They were gangsters, but they weren't Italian. That came in later when people from Italy came to America and established what we would call the mafia. This wasn't that. This is gangsterism. Didn't show any. They're Italian. They're Irish. They're Americans, and they were making money. And a lot of them became famous. They're like celebrities because we had newspapers that were promoting them, showing their exploits. People like Al Capone, Babyface Nelson, who was essentially a cold-blooded killer. These guys became kind of folklore heroes because it looked like they were doing something outside society. They're outlaws, and that they were admired. So their movies were made about them. That's in the 30s. I'm going to talk about that next week. But so this decade is winding down. And what happens at the end of the decade? They invent a way of recording sound. It's in your book. I want you guys to look at that, chapter 3. At the end of it, we come into sound and how it changed. It was a revolution of the highest order. And it's not what you think. It's, oh, now that people could talk. No, that's true. They could, but it was limited. The technology was very primitive. The microphones were very primitive, and they couldn't move around with a microphone. And so, if you see the early talking movies, the actors are usually standing still in one place, or they're sitting at the table, and there's sometimes a house plant between them. And in that house plant is planted the microphone. And so there was referred to as house plant acting. The actors are trying to get their voices recorded. And so they weren't necessarily paying attention to the other actor. And so it's really stiff. If you look at the part 2 of the movie, I want you guys to watch when sound comes in. It's on the story of film. You should start watching it. I'll sign it later. Hopefully you've watched part 1 because it follows the book. The book is in more detailed than the documentary, but the documentary gives you a good thumbnail sketch on how sound was affecting the new Hollywood, and it wasn't in a good way. All of a sudden, you couldn't be very creative with the camera because you couldn't move it because you had to be next to the microphone. And so it became, instead of a visual medium and actually moving images, movies, that's why it's called the movies, folks. People are moving. People were standing still. People were in homes and bars, and they were standing still or sitting still because they had to, because the primitive sound recording techniques. It wasn't until later that they'd be able to move the microphone. They got smaller cameras. Also, the cameras were so noisy in the silent era. The boom, the microphones picked up all that noise, and so they had to engulf the camera in these huge blimps to silence the camera because it made so much noise. And then, thus, they invented the sound stage. That's why it's called a sound stage. It's big airplane hangar stages. Maybe you've been on the Universal tour, heard about it. Warner Brothers, MGM, Fox, they all had these huge sound stages with these huge airplane hangar-like buildings that were padded with thick pads to prevent the sound from outside, the traffic, airplanes, people, from coming into the movie set. They're making westerns and gangster movies on the set, but it's modern Hollywood right outside the door. They weren't filming on location. They very often didn't because it was too hard and too laborious. And some directors who were silent directors, like Eric von Stroheim, literally quit when silent films came in because it took him out of his creative element. He was no longer a visual artist. He was told where to put the microphone, and he had to be on the sound stages, and he rebelled against it. And he literally stopped making movies. It was worth it to him to just walk away. And he made some of the greatest silent films of all time. He became an actor later on. We'll talk about that later. So he's still making his living in the movie industry, in sound movies, by the way. Anyway, so this is what's happening. Sound is a revolution, but it's not necessarily a good thing. People are losing their careers over it. Somebody like Rudolph Valentino will never know. He died early. He was only 26, I think. I'd have to, I can't remember, 26, 27. He died of something we probably would live through today. He had ruptured appendix, I think, and he shouldn't have died. But even in the 1920s, our medical was rather primitive compared to today, with antibiotics and surgeries and microscopic surgeries and the whole bit. They didn't have that then, and he died early, surprise to everybody, and it was a huge loss. He was as big in his day as, say, who's a big action star right now? Keanu Reeves, or 10 years ago would be, you know, Indiana Jones. What's his name? He's good. Star Wars, I'm talking Harrison Ford, or Bruce Willis. It's somebody of that caliber dying in the height of their fame. It was a huge tragic loss. There's a huge funeral in Hollywood. Thousands of people lined the streets for the burial of Rudolph Valentino. Probably, I guess you would call him the first true male action star. The women loved him. The men wanted to be him. The women wanted to sleep with him. The perfect combination. Everything that Tom Cruise isn't. Just kidding. Not really. Anyway, so the silent era gave rise to these huge stars, and their careers were essentially crushed when sound came in. Sound works with a camera at 24 frames a second. This is boring stuff. I realize that. The film stock, which is like this big, 35 millimeter, goes through the camera like this at 24 frames a second. Well, in the old days, they hand cranked it, and they went a little faster, 17 frames a second. But that was too fast for sound. The recording device was a huge instrument, worked at 24 frames a second. And so if the camera and the sound were in sync together, that's why it's called sync sound, is because they're both operating, the camera and the recorder were operating at 24 frames a second. Changed the whole visual medium again. Now movies look different. They sounded different. And that was the start of where we are today. It took them a while to perfect it to where they could get small microphones, and they get a moving boom microphone that could be moved when the actors move and the camera's moving with it. This all took a lot of time and effort and technology to figure out how to use. In these huge behemoth sound stages. So, directors had to change their style. In silent films, when a director is directing, that's the guy who's telling the actors what to do, what the camera should do, everything. He could say it when the camera is rolling. He could tell the actors, not enough emotion, you need a little bit more, or dial it down, or move over to that door. They could actually give directions as they were filming. Well, this had all stopped because it would record his speaking voice. And so now they couldn't talk when they were filming. Yes, you can talk a bit if you want, but it's a hassle taking your voice out of the synced up sound of the movie. I've directed a couple movies, and you never wanted to speak up when the camera was rolling, but sometimes you had to. It's just a hassle on editing later on. So anyway, that's a whole another way of directing. So you really had to plan things out, talk to your cinematographer, which is the person operating the camera and the lights, and you have to talk to your actors, you have to talk to the musicians, everybody has to be on board, because once the sound camera started rolling, everybody had to be quiet on the sound stage as they're recording the ever important dialogue. Suddenly, movies became about speaking dialogue, telling the story through dialogue, which is instead of visuals. The camera was no longer recording the visuals, it was only recording actors talking. Lots of directors were not happy because it was constricting their creative um, impulses to actually make a movie. 1929, 1927, or thereabouts, getting ahead of myself, a film came out called The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson, who was a vaudeville star of the highest order. Yes, folks, he used to perform in blackface. He was a white Jew performing in blackface, and the audiences couldn't get enough of it. He was hugely famous, and he did this film called The Jazz Singer in 1927. It's about a cantor's son. A cantor is one of the head guys in the Jewish synagogue who wants to be a Broadway star. Well, it was looked down upon. He wanted to sing, and it was really frowned on. It was considered not a reputable profession. Um, it was not considered holy or religious at all, and it was considered crude and vulgar, and only crude and vulgar people would be interested in something like that. Now, in the movie, it's not a complete sound movie. There's a lot of silent sequences. I'll post it tonight. You'll see a little bit of what I'm talking about on YouTube modules. Um, it's half silent and half sound. Yes, he sings in it, and he plays the piano, and he does have conversations with his parents. Other parts, it's old school silent movie, because when they made this movie, that's right when sound came on, and they kind of put it in there at the last minute. Um, Let me write that down. Clip. Okay. Um, but after that, every silent movie, and there was lots of them that are already in the can, as they say, meaning finished. The Hollywood studios saw the end of it. They didn't know what to do with all those films that didn't have speaking dialogue on it, and they went back a lot and redid them because audiences, once they heard sound, that was it for them. They couldn't go back. The game was on. Sound was everything. And movies completely had to change literally overnight. Then in 1929, the stock market crashed. Maybe you've heard about this. This is the part of the humanities that you got to know about that's going on in the culture, the society outside of Hollywood. It crashed, went bankrupt. Millions of jobs were lost overnight. There were food lines around the block because people couldn't keep their jobs or pay for their rent. And people actually committed suicide. That's the myth. Somewhat of an urban myth, but people did. They jumped out of the windows of their Wall Street buildings because they didn't want to live in a world where stock markets were flatlined. So at the end of that, 1930 or thereabouts, prohibition was canceled. Booze was legal again. So right when the people had no money, no jobs, no apartment rent they could afford, they can now drink again. Hollywood changed with the times. This will be my next lecture when we go into the 1930s decade. Hope you stick with it with me, because now we're going to go into sound films like we'd never seen before. One final word on what I'm trying to do here. I'm going to go through each decade. Maybe you've seen that already. We just got done doing 1920 to 1930. I started doing the very first early decade of silent films or film industry. Next up, the 1930s, Depression. See you then when Story Film continues. Enjoy.